Hi class, welcome to week 3. This week we will be discussing standards, goals, learning objectives, and learning targets. So let's talk about why we need these things. Well, you wouldn't go on a trip without a roadmap of some kind, either on your phone or old-fashioned paper map. And so we don't need to do instruction unless we have a roadmap about where we'd want to take students. And standards, goals, targets, etc., are the roadmap for learning. What do we want the outcomes for students to be? All of these play key roles in both the instructional and assessment processes, as soon we'll see. And like we just said, they're the maps to what you want students to be able to learn and be able to do. You start with standards first, and then goals, objectives, and targets follow. So let's begin with a standard. What is a learning standard? It's a specific statement of what students should be able to know or do in major content areas. Often standards are composed and shared at the state or even the national level. These are big bodies of outcomes. There are many different types of standards. You could have standards focused on content, so what you want students to know, performance, what you want them to be able to do, developmental, so you want them to be able to, for example, to tie their shoes by a certain age, or even grade level specific standards, which many of the state tests are based around. From the standards, we create goals, learning objectives, learning targets, lesson plans, and assessments. But you always start with the standards, and it's important that all of these things be aligned. Here's an example of a standard from New York State, Standard 4 in Science. It says that students will understand and apply scientific concepts, principles, and theories pertaining to the physical setting and living environment and recognize the historical development of ideas in science. You can see that this is quite a broad standard, and standards do tend to contain a lot of ideas. So we're going to learn later that we have to deconstruct or break down the standard to think of appropriate learning targets that might align with them. On the course homepage, you will find a body of standards in different subject areas: language arts, math, science, social studies, and more. And we will be using these throughout the semester. I encourage you, and one of the activities I believe this week requires that you go and look through those standards. So I mentioned that you have to deconstruct standards. Think of the word deconstruct like unpacking. If you have a stuffed suitcase when you go on a trip, you're going to probably want to organize it or unpack it when you get to your destination so that you can understand and know where everything is. Similarly, it's important to unpack these very broad standards. When you do that, ask yourself 3 questions. What is it that you want the student to know? What is it that they need to understand? And what is it that they need to be able to do? Let's take a look at an example. This is a kindergarten standard from science. Plan and conduct an investigation to compare the effects of different strengths or different directions of pushes and pulls on the motion of an object. This is actually straight out of the Next Generation Science Standards, which is a national body of standards for the teaching of science. Many states have adopted them or adopted some version of them. Now, if you look at that standard, there's a lot going on in there. Investigations, motions, pushes, pulls, directions. Where do you begin to really focus in on the specific things that you want students to be able to know, understand, or do? If we look carefully at the phrases in the standard, students must know certain things by the end of the instruction. We want them to know that pushes and pulls can have different strengths and directions. So for example, if I were teaching this outcome, I'd want them to know that if you push harder on a toy truck, it's going to go farther. And if you change the way it's pointed, or if you pull it, it's going to go in a different direction. We also want them to know that when objects collide, they push on one another and can change motion. We also want them to know that a bigger push or pull makes things speed up or slow down more quickly. So this is a very basic, fundamental level of understanding for kindergartners. That's all packed into the wording of the standard. We also want students to understand something, a bigger important concept that goes across many different standards, that simple tests can be designed to determine cause and effect. So presumably, we're going to design some lessons where students set up experiments with things like toy trucks or things that push and pull, and determine the cause of the truck going farther. And so not only do they start to learn the content, but they start to understand what it is to design an investigation. And finally, we want them to be able to plan and conduct an investigation. So all of these things are packed tightly into that one standard. So it's important to unpack or deconstruct the standard before you begin to think about your learning goals, objectives, and targets. The next level down from the standard is a learning goal. What is a learning goal? It's a broad statement of what students will know and be able to do over large blocks of instructional time. So this might go over a year, or this might go over a month or two, not just a lesson. Learning goals tend to be more general and therefore less measurable than standards or objectives. Examples of learning goals might be students will understand and appreciate scientific knowledge. If you think about that, that's a really hard thing to measure. How are you going to measure appreciation of scientific knowledge? There are ways, but it's not the usual ways that we assess in the classroom. Students want to learn to think and study independently. So you see that these are goals that go on throughout the year. Notice also that learning goals may have words such as understand and appreciate because they're not meant to be totally measurable. The next level down, we have standards, then we have learning goals, we have educational objectives. And this is what we often deal with on lesson plans and in our classrooms. So what is an educational objective? It's a specific statement of student performance that should be demonstrated at the end of the instructional unit or lesson. So you could have an objective just for one lesson, or you could have it for a series of lessons in a unit. It's an outcome. What do you want the students to be able to know or do? You write your educational outcome based on your standard that's deconstructed or unpacked. Sometimes these educational objectives and even goals are given to us in curricular guides and units, and sometimes we write our own. The objective must be very measurable. You have to be able to think, how would you assess it? And I always tell students when you're beginning to write objectives, start them with the words, students will be able to. Sometimes we even abbreviate that SWBAT. When you see that in the course, it means students will be able to. And then follow that with an action verb, something that you can see, define, list, compare. Other ones might be explain, diagram, solve. These are things the students should be able to do and you can see them doing it. It's an action. This is very different than a word like understand, which is not an action verb. You can't see them doing it, and therefore it's hard to measure. So an example would be students will be able to multiply a two-digit number by another two-digit number. So you could see students doing this and you could score it and it would be very measurable. They can do it or they can't do it correctly. Another one might be student will be able to underline the verb and subject in a student's. Notice in both of these cases, we have action verbs, multiply and underline, making these objectives very measurable. It's important to be clear. Learning objectives are sometimes mistakenly stated in terms of actions to be taken, and it might seem clear. For example, students will be able to use a microscope. Okay, well, that's an action verb, use, but it may sound clear, but it's less clear about intended learning outcomes and does not point to the type of student assessment that would be suitable. So, how do you test being able to use a microscope? Well, you're going to have to break it down into the skills that are required to use a microscope. So instead, focus on specific outcomes by using specific action verbs that point to the skills required to use a microscope. So instead of just saying be able to use a microscope, you might be able to get specific, like students will be able to identify the parts of a microscope. Focus a microscope on a pre-prepared slide using the coarse and fine adjustment knobs, and use a microscope to make observations of a pre-prepared slide. So you could see how these three skills broken out are much more specific and measurable than just be able to use a microscope. You could even see, if you do the objectives correctly, how you would assess them. For example, identify the parts of a microscope might be done with a diagram where they label the parts. Focus a microscope on a slide might be having them come up one by one and asking them to do that, perform that skill, and then see if they can do it or not. And then use a microscope to make observations of a pre-prepared slide might be asking them once they get it focused to draw what they see. So when you get the objectives done correctly, the assessment almost presents itself. There are three types of learning objectives. We talk a lot about the first one, but I want to cover the other two as well. Cognitive learning objectives are what we mostly do in class. This is what students should know. So students will be able to name the US presidents or what they will do. Students will be able to conduct a scientific investigation, etc. But other types of learning objectives exist as well. For example, affective learning objectives deal with students' interests, attitudes, appreciation, motivation, those feelings. And those could be written like students will be able to work independently, demonstrate an increased appreciation of mathematics. These are a little harder to measure, but there are ways to measure them, and we call them affective learning objectives. Psychomotor deals with perceptual and motor skills, such as students will be able to tie their shoes. Students will be able to run a mile in under 10 minutes. These are more physical tasks. Whatever type of learning objective, if you use them in your lesson plans, they must be standards-based. You always begin with the standard. Now again, sometimes these standards are given to you in your curricular units, and sometimes you have to make the connection. Once you have your standard, you design your goals and objectives to help students meet the standard. Objectives must be specific, as we've seen, think two-digit by two-digit. They must be clear, that must be straightforward and readable, and they must be measurable. How will you know that a student has met the objective? Once you get them correct, again, the assessment almost presents itself. So again, write objectives students will be able to and give an action verb. Don't use the words know or understand in learning objectives. It's too vague and it's too difficult to assess, to measure. Think of how you want them to be able to demonstrate knowledge or skill and use other words. So again, action words might be identify, explain, match, differentiate, apply, anything you can see them doing. Benjamin Bloom came up with a taxonomy of levels of learning that are very helpful when we consider how to write learning objectives. It starts with a basic level. Remember, when we want students to remember something, we're asking them to identify, recall, list, match, and these are helpful, powerful action verbs for this basic level of learning. An example might be match major battles of the Civil War with the dates they occurred. A second level of learning, and unlike this chart, you're going into higher levels um, and more complicated levels the further down you go. Understand would be things like once they've learned the basics, you want them to compare and contrast, describe, conclude. So a level two Bloom taxonomy might be compare the perspectives of the U.S. and the Confederacy on states' rights issues. The third level is apply, and this asks them to discuss or describe or use, in other words, to take the knowledge they've learned at the first two levels and apply it to something. An objective might be using an article on a current issue, discuss how the issue might be perceived by the leaders of the Confederacy. A fourth learning level would be to analyze. Discriminate, outline, attribute, discuss, describe, analyze are all good action verbs. Students will analyze and describe causes of the Civil War and provide historical evidence. Our top two levels are evaluate, which means to judge, test, discuss, describe. And an example might be evaluate and describe why the North won the Civil War. Or on the final level is create, once they know all of the knowledge and they've used it in these different ways, to expect them to go and create something with that. Design, construct, create. For example, create a video depicting the impact of the Civil War on a current political issue. Now, these learning objectives might be appropriate for secondary, but preschool and kindergarten teachers can use the same technique. Starting with basic skills, such as identify colors, or compare and contrast dark and light colors. Apply, describe the different colors of the rainbow, etc. You could take it all the way up until finally they're creating a color wheel, for example. This is Bloom's taxonomy has been helpful for a couple of decades now in helping teachers think about where students need to start at a very basic learning level and how to get them up to higher levels of thinking, critical thinking, and the specific action verbs that they could use to describe the objectives at each level. Now we've talked about standards and goals and learning objectives. What I've been hoping to get you to is the learning target. And the learning target is very similar to the learning objective. It's basically the learning objective plus assessment and criteria for success. So when you're thinking about a learning target, think about an archery target. It has those concentric circles, and you try to shoot an arrow, and you try to hit the bullseye in the center. Think about a learning target the same way. What's going to be the center? What's going to be the criterion for that will you allow you to say that the student has met that target, has been successful? Let's take an example. A learning objective might be written. Students will be able to identify an obtuse triangle. And that's an objective, but it doesn't tell you how it would be assessed, and it doesn't tell you what the criterion for success is. How will you know the student has mastered the concept? A learning target instead might be students will be able to identify an obtuse triangle. Notice the underlined part is the same as the learning objective. But then by drawing 5 different obtuse triangles, the words in italics are the assessment. You're going to ask them on a test to draw 5 different obtuse triangles in 5 minutes or less. And that's our criterion. So you're going to get 5 accurately in 5 minutes or less. So by adding the assessment and the criterion for success, we've turned a learning objective into a learning target. Many teachers, for learning purposes, when they will post their learning targets or objectives, but they'll also give out exemplars or anchors, and your textbook discusses this. And these are examples of excellent finished products. Some teachers I've heard say, oh, I don't give those out because I don't want students to copy them. But I would argue that it's important for students to have a model of what something good looks like. And so when you're doing, for example, later we're going to be doing rubrics, you could hand out work from a previous year, for example, an essay, and say, this is what a level 5 essay looks like. Or for you preschool teachers, you could hand out, or you could demonstrate, have a student who's already mastered shoe tying and bring them up to the front of the room and say, this is what shoe tying is, and this is what you need to get to. So exemplars or anchors are examples of excellent finished products. Some teachers save work from year to year, removing the names and sharing with students when you give an assignment. Now, there are several types of learning targets. Cognitive learning targets are broken into a couple of different levels, and these cognitive learning targets again cover knowledge and what we want students to know. 2 levels: knowledge and simple understanding. This is sort of akin to the first few levels on the Bloom's taxonomy that we just covered. When you want students to remember simple facts or simple concepts and ideas, we call this knowledge and simple understanding. And at this level, we're using words like know, comprehend, and apply. But again, we're translating them into action verbs, such as students will be able to identify major battles by date and location with an 80% accuracy. That's a good learning target. It identifies the criterion for success. Or students will be able to describe 3 regions where most Civil War battles took place. So that's a simple understanding. A more advanced type of cognitive learning target is deep understanding and reasoning. This corresponds to the analyze, evaluate, and create. Deep understanding means knowing the essence of something and using knowledge in sophisticated ways. For example, students will be able to analyze 3 economic causes of the Civil War. So that requires a much deeper level of understanding than just being able to cite Civil War dates. Reasoning is also something that's more complicated, and it requires the mental manipulation of knowledge to interpret, solve problems, and more. An example here might be students will be able to develop an argument that presents a way the Civil War might have been averted and support his or her argument with 5 pieces of evidence from primary sources. So this is a way that this is a target that requires students to mentally manipulate the knowledge they have learned to develop that argument for how to avoid the Civil War. Again, much deeper level of understanding, deep understanding and reasoning. Skills are another type of learning target. This is instead of what you want them to know, what you want them to be able to do. So students will be able to write a haiku poem. So this is a performance. Affect, again, getting back to students' dispositions, students will be able to demonstrate an improvement in attitudes towards school. So how should you go about selecting or writing learning targets? Well, first of all, you should think about the number that's appropriate. You shouldn't really do more than one, at the most three learning targets per lesson. They need to be specific, but any more than three, you're trying to cover too much. As we've already said, it needs to be related to standards. It's good to mix your target types. So have some basic knowledge and then some deeper understanding, for example. Targets need to be challenging yet feasible. So a little bit difficult for students, but you don't want to overwhelm students and make it so difficult that they can't do it. You think of learning like a ladder, and so students go from one step to the next step to the next step. You wouldn't put a student at the bottom and expect them to jump up to the top. Learning targets should be consistent with current principles of learning and motivation. And so what this means is you really need to familiarize yourself with principles of learning and motivation. Those of you who are in adolescent studies will get this through a course, 517, which I also teach. Our vocabulary this week has been covered in this lecture. And don't forget that you have an opportunity for extra credit to do the vocabulary template once a week, every week, filling that template out that's in the assignments folder and writing the definition and using it in a Word, and then uploading it in May for up to 5 points of extra credit in the course.